Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. I am William Bell, your co-host, along with Don Preston. And Don is in the studio with us. We're looking forward to a great study tonight as we continue to review David Brown's lectures, David Brown's presentation at the Bellview Lectures, which took place this past June or July. I can't remember which one it was, but of 2015. And they decided that they were going to critique covenant eschatology of all things, however, refused to even accept our invitation to come down and be willing to be live and have some open discussions about it, which, we thought was rather strange. Of course, we're having some meetings, one in July at the Preterist Pilgrim Weekend, and we are planning to have another one here in Memphis in October. And, of course, they are welcome to come. We would be delighted to have them as our guests. At any rate, Don's with me, and how are you doing, Don?
Oh, absolutely fantastic, William. Been a very, very exciting day. Had a long conversation with a Baptist minister today from Oklahoma that is shall we say, a brand new convert to the view of covenant eschatology, and he said he'd been toying with the idea, said he had been seeing the direction of covenant eschatology for a good little while, and I suppose that what is particularly exciting about it to me, because it involves me, said he had been listening to my presentation on Paul on trial in my series on Acts and the Restoration of Israel. And he said that once he listened to that series of lessons of Paul on trial, he said that was just it. He said everything just fell into place. And as I told him, I will remember looking at and discovering the difficulties and the challenges that Paul, as he was on trial before Felix, Festus, and Agrippa, and realizing that everything that Paul said there was contrary to my traditional views. And it really was kind of a stunning revelation to me as well. So anyway, I had that great conversation with a Baptist minister, and then following that, I had a great conversation with a minister from Alabama, who is a minister, and he is a brand new preterist as well, has been sharing the concepts of covenant eschatology with his congregation. His elders have put him on notice that he needs to, quote, cool his jets, unquote, and slow down. But he said, man, this is just absolutely so exciting. So those are two absolutely great conversations that I've had just today. And it's just indicative of the growing interest that is manifesting itself in place after place after place all around the world. It's really exciting stuff.
Well, that's very good to hear. And, we continue to have responses to the messages that we have been sharing through all of the venues that we're doing. I know that you're using Facebook heavily and YouTube, and I have conversations going on back and forth on YouTube, and we've been looking at the possibility of a debate, but so far I haven't heard that response that I was kind of expecting when they asked if we would do it. And so it may be forthcoming. I guess, they have to decide if they want to do that, but it's still good. And so we're hearing more people, come out and teach. And so we've got some opportunities. As a matter of fact, there's another venue that I will speak on another broadcast that is, has a new audience, is what I'm saying. And I'm trying to move into some of that new territory, which I know you are too, where people are not familiar with. They've never heard of it. They can't believe anybody could even believe it. And so yet we have an opportunity to share the message in those particular areas. So that's very good. I was listening to our intro and I said, man, we're going to have to change that pretty soon, because I think you've got about 50 books now.
Well, maybe not quite that many, but I'm working on it.
I know. I might be approaching 5, so we'll have to change that sometime in the near future. But
it is exciting, as you well know, and as I was sharing with you before we came on the air. I have a major new book on Daniel chapter 12. I began the upload of it today for publication. I am currently waiting on a cover, a finalized cover, and I'm very, very excited. As I said, it is a major new book. It is over 400 pages long, counting indices, bibliography, topical index, et cetera. So it's a very large book. But, William, you and I both know of the radical changes that have been taking place in both the postmillennial and as well as the amillennial world. Historically and in the creeds, the text of Daniel chapter 12 has all but invariably been seen as predictive of the, quote, final resurrection, unquote. Now, you can find some exceptions to that. You can find some men who took the position that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, in his prediction of the resurrection actually applied to 3 or 4 different events. I mean, they said, well, it means this, and it means that, and then it means this. But ultimately, they viewed it as a prediction of the final resurrection of the physical body at the so-called end of time. Well, just over the last several years, in both the dominionist / postmillennial world as well as the amillennial world, and with the growth of covenant eschatology, the futurist views have had to take a different approach. They have realized that if they acknowledge that Daniel chapter 12 is predictive of the final resurrection, then guess what? The game's over. There is no futurist eschatology, because once you admit that Daniel chapter 12 is a resurrection text, then you don't have a basis for a futurist eschatology. And the so-called argument that, okay, Daniel chapter 12 is resurrection, and it happened in AD 70, but it was typological, a foreshadowing of the real resurrection, just simply will not fly biblically and exegetically. And so in this book, as you know, because you were kind enough to write the foreword to it, but I try to cover all of the bases, all of the objections, all of the arguments that are currently out there that I'm aware of people attempting to deflect the power of Daniel chapter. And I can tell you that the few people who have reviewed it so far, that have helped with the indices, who have proofread, who have done this, who have done that to help me out with the book, have every one of them have said, this is the best book that I have produced to date. So I've tried to be very thorough. I've tried to cover all of the bases, and I really believe that the book will be very, very effective if people will have the integrity, the honesty, and the integrity and the open mind to read this book. They will see that Daniel chapter 12 predicted the, quote, final resurrection, and that resurrection occurred in AD 70, and there is no justification for any kind of a futurist eschatology. So I'm very excited. It's very, very close to publication, and I've got another major book in the works. Then I am working with another author on another book that we will publish that is an excellent book on the deity of Christ. It's just really an excellent book, and I'm very anxious to get it finished and get it published. I won't say much more about it, but I will say it's a very, very good book.
Well, that's good. Well, I did have the privilege of writing the foreword for Dunn's book on the resurrection in Daniel 12, and I was just amazed at the in-depth, of course he's always very thorough and very precise in his argumentation, but the depth and breadth of what he covered, as well as answering all of the critics that are of note that have weighed in on the conversation of resurrection in the past few years or that are current. I mean, he addresses them and just basically demolishes them. I mean, it's just absolutely so incredibly clear and forceful in terms of the argumentation that's in that book. And I would recommend, if you need to start putting your orders in right now, because I mean, it's going to be a classic. This is going to be a standard book on the resurrection. And there's no stone left unturned. There is no argument left to be made for the most part. I mean, there's always something new that come up. But I'm telling you, you could take this book and you could defend resurrection anywhere with anybody at any time and still have, some bullets left over when you get through. So it's just it's an amazing book, and I enjoyed going through it. It took me a while to get to it, but once I got to it, I mean, it was like, hey, this is really good stuff. So I want to encourage you to do that, to get that. I never thought I'd be saying I'm writing another book because it's always a challenge. But I have a couple of books in the works. One of them on the regathering of Israel, and another one I have written and finished. And really it was kind of like the first book I wrote. It was from the book of Galatians turned out to be just a written lecture. Well, this one turned out to be a written sermon, and it was on the Psalms, but it expanded into a little book. And it's not what I would consider a super scholarly work. That wasn't my intent for writing the book, but it was simply to show some perspectives on the 23rd Psalm that I had never seen before. I did run across a book later, just in kind of checking other people and things out that had some of the concepts in there, but I don't think they took it as far as I did to tie it into so much of eschatology that's in the 23rd Psalm, and it's just amazing when you get into it. And even now, I'm still tempted to add more stuff to the book, but I've got it published. And here's what I probably won't do a revision or a new edition of it until maybe another year, because I need to let some of it settle in and just continue to do the research. But here's what's happened since I've published the book. I've had people buy the book for their Bible classes, and this was my purpose for doing it, to make it, a book that the average person wouldn't have too much of a hurdle, receiving. And so I've had some people who were not even, I never considered that they would even buy the book. These were business people. I've had them buy the book for their Bible class. One guy bought several copies. He says, I'm using this for my Bible class. I had another real estate agent buy some books to give away when he sells houses. And I had another person who owns a flooring store to buy a bunch of books to give away to her customers. because
Cool.
they are sometimes looking for, some nice things to give away, and usually they give away cookbooks. But now, they're giving away this book, at least they have, and hopefully they'll do it before people find out what's in it and bring it back to them.
What did you give me?
But to me, that is really, really good. And actually, Don, I have a book signing at the Tennessee Regular Baptist Bookstore on Saturday, and I would have done it this past Saturday, but I had sold all the copies out that I had in, and so I just got another batch in today, actually. So I'm going to go by there and just see, what happens. But the guy in the bookstore told me that he was going to carry some of the books. He said he was going to get some from me, and he asked me if I would be willing to do a book signing. So I told him, yeah. So I'm going to go over there Saturday from 11 to 1 and do a book signing. And I have a couple of other bookstores that are evaluating the book to see if they will carry it. And then I have another, quote, Church of Christ bookstore that I got to take it by to see if I can get in the door without getting shot.
Well, we know how that goes if they recognize you.
Yeah, well, they know me very well. I can tell you that. The guy who runs the store is a preacher in the city. I had conversations with him years ago. And I think we had one conversation where he called me one night and we got into a discussion on Matthew 5:17 and 18, and we have not had another discussion since. As a matter of fact, the last time a conversation came up is when he was doing a meeting at another church, another Church of Christ, and some of the members from our congregation were there, and he was teaching on Revelation. So he was asking questions, basically, that he thought no one knew the answers to but him. And I had about 3 or 4 people in the audience. I didn't even know they were there. They had gone, and they were answering every single question that he brought up. And so here's what they did. He asked them, he says, "Where are you all from?" And they said, "From William Bell's congregation." and at that point, then they told me that they went. So I went, and he shut the meeting down. He said, "There will be no more questions."
Oh, wow.
That actually happened.
My goodness gracious.
I kid you not. So I kind of doubt very seriously. But one of the guys that we have with us now used to go to his congregation, and he is just absolutely eating up covenant eschatology. Done every Sunday, every Wednesday night. It's like he has just left earth and gone to heaven because of what he's learning. I mean, I'm serious. And he expresses it. He is really, really thrilled about what he's learning and how much he's been in the church for 40 years now. And was an active brother. He served as an elder before, I think, and he's also been, a deacon at congregations. Even served with the guy that I taught covenant eschatology to, who espoused it and then recanted publicly, I should say. I don't know what he believes now, but I know he recanted publicly so he wouldn't lose his job. But at any rate, he is just on fire with it, and just is totally amazing. He said, "Man, I can't believe we have been in the church for 40 years, or I've been there for 40 years, and I've never heard the gospel taught like this."
Yeah,
and
yeah.
That's like every week. Every week.
That's part of the excitement that when people begin to see answers for the very first time in their life, that they have perhaps sat on the pews. They may have even taught Bible classes themselves. But look, one of the ministers, another man that I spoke to on the phone today, he said, I preach it. I won't even mention where he preaches, but he said, I brought up James 5, 8, and 9. The coming of the Lord has drawn near. And I pointed out the Greek of the text is in the perfect tense, and so it's literally has drawn near. It's not, as the good old King James Version says, the coming of the Lord is at hand. It is literally the coming of the Lord has drawn near, which just adds force to the imminence of the statement. And he said, yes. He said, as a matter of fact, he said, just recently, he said, I encountered that. And he said, I grabbed some of the commentators that I had on the shelf, and he said, I realized how disingenuous the comments were on it. And he said, but do you know how the minister of this congregation, where I am now, do you know how he handled James chapter 5? And I said, no, I don't have any idea. And he said, he told me himself that when he would go through the book of James, he stopped at James chapter 5, verse 4. He refused to go any further. And, you know, how many times, William, have you and I encountered ministers who tell us that when it came to eschatological texts, that they, in their own terminology, that they did the Passover on them.
Oh,
that
yeah.
They absolutely, they just refused to deal with the eschatology of the text because in their own estimation, in their own admission, they didn't have any answers. They didn't know what these verses were saying. And so it's so exciting and thrilling to hear from men who are now, for the very first time in their life and in their ministry, who are finding answers. And I suppose that's what makes it so disturbing when we listen to men such as David Brown, who has absolutely zero interest in opening his heart and opening his mind. He is a man that believes with all of his heart, I suppose, that he has all the answers. And therefore, the arrogance, shall I say, the smugness that is manifested and that was manifested in his presentations at the Bellview Church of Christ, June 2015, it's really quite appalling. And I must say this, in all honesty and all objectivity, when I was a young man, I exhibited the very kind of arrogance, the very kind of haughtiness, the very kind of smugness that I saw from David Brown and the other speakers on the platform at the Bellview Church of Christ lectureship. And yet I came to realize I was wrong. I was flat dead wrong. My hermeneutic was wrong. My exegesis of these texts were wrong. And so when I looked at the title of David Brown's lecture, Old Testament Text Misused by Realized Eschatology, you know, I was going, okay, let's see what David Brown actually does insofar as exegeting Old Testament passages that he claims that we misuse. Well, we've already seen in last week's program how he claims that we misuse the term the last days. And he makes the claim, which we exposed as false last week, there's not a text that these men use that supports their doctrine, not even one, unquote. And yet he turns around on Daniel chapter 12 and says that Daniel chapter 12 was speaking of the resurrection of Israel. Where does he put that? AD 70. He agrees with us. Therefore, we as preterists and David Brown agree on a text, a resurrection text, that applied to AD 70. He says we don't have a text, but he agrees with us. This is an AD 70 resurrection text. He just destroyed his own argument.
Absolutely.
I mean, and it just goes on and on like that. And to get into our discussion tonight, one of the things, William, that I found totally disingenuous is he says, quote, these people, and it's interesting, William, he used that term, these people, over and over. And he was clearly using that in some kind of a derogatory manner. It was never these brethren. It was never our brethren who espoused this view. It was always simply these people. And you just got the sense that he holds us in such disdain, that he has us pigeonholed in such a way that we're we're certainly sub-brethren. We're absolutely not to be considered brethren in fellowship. That he left little doubt of that. But anyway, he said, these people have evolved because they are trying to make things fit, unquote. And I thought, so what's the problem? I mean, there's a problem with trying to make everything fit together.
Sounds like line upon line, precept upon precept to me, doesn't it?
That's what it sounds like to me. and I couldn't help but think, William, in the early days of what's known as the Restoration Movement, or even to go back to the days of the Reformation Movement in the 16th century, the days of Martin Luther, and later the days of John Calvin, does David Brown think that those movements by Luther or by Calvin had all of their theology completely and totally worked out? Agree or disagree with it? That's not the point. I'm just simply asking the question. Is David Brown so naive and so historically ignorant as to say or to believe that Luther had his entire system worked out, did not evolve? Would he make the same argument about Calvin, that Calvin's system did not evolve? But more apropos to him, of course, and to those in his fellowship, is he so historically naive as to believe that the Restoration Movement did not evolve? That members of the Restoration Movement did not have all the pieces together in a harmonious, symphonic type of theology? I mean, it is ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous, for David Brown to stand on the platform and ridicule the preterist movement for, quote, evolving, as if the Restoration Movement itself did not evolve. One might even ask, how long was it after the beginning of the Restoration Movement before the name Church of Christ began to be adopted as the dominant name? They were called Campbellites by the outside people. They didn't know what to call themselves initially. They wanted to be called Christians only. That was Campbell's desire. Campbell, who, by the way, in that regard was just like Luther and just like Calvin and just like John Wesley, did not want to found a new church, a new religion. And he urged his followers, don't call yourselves Campbellites. Just call yourselves Christians, followers of Jesus. So when you look at the history of the Restoration Movement, I mean, my goodness gracious, to say that it did not evolve, to imply that it did not evolve, is absolutely, utterly, and I use the term in its fullest proper sense, I'm not trying to be insulting, but to use the term in the proper sense is a truly ignorant statement, because it betrays an ignorance of the history of the Restoration Movement. To say, well, the preterist movement, these people have evolved because, they started changing their views to make things fit, and they've changed over the years. So what? The discovery or the rediscovery of truth naturally leads to re-examination of other doctrines. That was true of the Reformation movement. It was true of virtually every restorationist type of movement throughout history, it was certainly true of the Restoration movement initiated by Alexander Campbell and those who have followed after him. To deny that is to demonstrate an ignorance of history. And then, William, he said, now look, folks, when you're examining anyone's doctrine, what you've got to find out, you've got to get at the root of it. Now, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but he said, what is their basic premise? When you find their basic premise, then you attack that basic premise if it's false. So find out what it is about the preterist movement that is their basic fundamental premise. He said, I'll tell you what it is. Their basic premise is all things written have been fulfilled. Well, okay. I do make that claim. You make that claim. It was amazing then how he set out to prove that premise is not true. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. Remember what we said a few moments ago, folks, that David Brown, along with Doug McClish, and with one other of the speakers on the Bellview Church of Christ lecture, admitted that Daniel chapter 12 predicts the corporate spiritual resurrection of Israel in AD 70. They believe that Israel, the mortal body of Israel, the corruptible body of Israel, was resurrected into the spiritual body of Christ, resurrected as the body of Christ. One of these ministers that called today, I was sharing with him, and he said, you know, I'm starting really to get a hold of the fact that when the Bible talks about the body and the Bible talks about flesh, it's not really using it in terms that we're used to using. And he said, I've heard you on your YouTubes talk about how Paul and the New Testament writers did not use the terms body and flesh and mortal, et cetera, in the way that we do in modern terms. I said, yeah. I said, we've got to think Hebraically. The Hebraic way of thinking of body and mortality and what have you is absolutely not the Hellenistic, Grecian, Western way of thinking and speaking of the mortal body and things like that. And all of a sudden, it seemed like the lights came on. He goes, wait a minute. He said, so when Paul talks about the mortal body in Romans chapter 8, he's not talking about the physical body. I said, bingo. And he said, and that explains 1 Corinthians 15, doesn't it? Flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. I said, that's exactly and precisely correct. So even though he's a new preterist, he had not yet tapped into some of those really critical things to understand. And by the way, William, I will tell you this privately off air later, but I will tell you that another person called today telling me about some professors at a Christian university who are watching our YouTube videos and who have gone on record as saying that if they could find answers to 1 Corinthians 15, that they could accept covenant eschatology.
Whoa.
I volunteered you and myself to have a absolutely strictly confidential sit-down study day with those professors at any time of their choosing. And I'll share that news with you privately because, again, I won't tell where that university was. I'm not going to share anything that might point to who it was or where it was. This is strictly something that I wanted to share with William there, anyone who's listening. But again, I'm not sharing anything beyond that. It's just ultra exciting stuff.
Cool.
Okay. Absolutely. William, I know that in your experience and in mine, Luke 21:22 played a pivotal role in your transformation to a full preterist. Why don't you share your thoughts and your experience with the audience?
Sure, Don. I titled my website "All Things Fulfill" based on that. It was just the most natural thing for me to do. After my experience with it, I started off as a very inquisitive seeker of an understanding of the Book of Revelation, and I was most impressed by the documentation and the research on the date, which I found, of course, in Fort Wallace's commentary initially, and then I started to look for other means to research that. And the more I researched it, I became convinced very early on, within 6 months of becoming a Christian, that Revelation was written before 70 A.D. And then from that, my next step was to go to Matthew 24 and study that, because of the correlations between Revelation and Matthew 24, and and of course Mark and Luke as well. And so for a while I held a dual view, and I happened to be studying, and I used to have this little room on the back of my house, and when I lived in another place, that was the same house I was living in when you and I met over the phone. But at any rate, I had this little room, and it was a closet, really, a storage room, and I just turned it into a little library study. And I would go out there and just spend hours at a time, sometimes just reading and studying. And so one afternoon, I can't remember whether it was a Saturday afternoon or what, but it was one day I was out there, and I happened to be reading Luke 21, and I read that verses 20 through 22, and it just absolutely just blew my mind. And my initial first thought was, the New Testament was not yet written when Jesus made this statement, because I knew he had not died. And keep in mind, I was, a pretty young Christian at the time. Maybe I'd been in the church maybe 1 or 2 years, but I studied like you couldn't believe at the time. And so after reading that, that was the first question I had, and I said, then the next thing I did after saying, okay, he could not be talking about the New Testament. He has to be talking about the Old Testament. And I said, well, my next step is to look in the Old Testament to see if I can find anything related to judgment, resurrection, the coming of the Lord, and the kingdom. And primarily it was resurrection and judgment, because those were the two biggies, if you please. And so immediately I went to Daniel 12. I think I went to Isaiah 25, and can't remember which other ones, but those were the two. And I said, well, there's Daniel 12 right there. And then I checked out some passages in the Psalms, Psalm 97, 98. There's a couple of them in that category that talked about judging the Lord, and I traced that back to Deuteronomy, and I said, whoa, this is quite interesting. And so after that, I was convinced pretty much right on the spot, because it was logical. I knew that you could not make the statement that Jesus made and then turn around and try to deny the rest of those statements. They had to be fulfilled at that point, and that's a point which I've never deviated from. I still hold it, use it in debates and teachings to this very day, because it's just that solid. And so I looked at the connection with the destruction of Jerusalem, and so the third thing I said, well, if this is true, then the law did not end at the cross. It had to continue until 70 A.D. And of course, after reading the rest of the chapter, you had this generation there. And so after I had done that, then I started to think about, okay, now what do I do with what I know and what I've learned? So the first thing I did, when this is so funny, I shared it with Leora. Leora thought that I was losing my mind. she still thinks that today. It's just not that bad. But she thought I had actually lost my mind, and I guess I had from that. I lost the mind that I had for believing something different, and that was a good thing.
Indeed. Yes.
So, yeah, I traded off my human thinking for the mind of Christ on that issue. And then the next thing I did was I said, okay, let me start getting some third-party input on this, somebody who's not emotionally connected to me, and let's see what they say. So the preacher in our congregation, I don't know if I was still, I think I was in preaching school at the time, so yeah, he was still there. So I called him up, and we had several studies. As a matter of fact, we had sort of mock debates over the dating of Revelation because he took the later date, but he never could get a hands up, when I was doing the earlier date. But he was always seemingly afraid that of that argument or of that conversation, and so that went on for a while. But at any rate, I gave it to him, and I gave it to another person, and that person in the congregation. She's a female, but she's been with us for years. Her and her mom passed some time ago. So I just called them up on the phone because they were two people who studied a lot in our congregation. And I gave the verse to him, I gave it to her. Within about 5 minutes, she called back. And she said, William, I do not even want to begin to think about what this text could mean. I said, so you see, don't you? And so we kind of acknowledged it, and she was just, in her characteristic way, was just, surprised, amazed, and confounded all at the same time, and scared and worried, too, because she knew that it meant something pretty critical.
Mm-hmm.
However, the preacher never called me back, and hasn't to this day, to discuss that text. To this day, has never called me back to discuss the merits of that text. I think I might have called him and asked about it, but, never did get much from it. So that told me, when he did not call me back, that I was on the right track. I said, so he sees it too. He's just not going to acknowledge it. And from that point on, as a matter of fact, I think I might have been teaching the book of Revelation at that time. I'm not sure, but I remember this same person. No, I wasn't teaching that. But one of the reasons I called that person was because I was teaching the dating of the book of Revelation as being prior to 70 A.D., and the elders were about to shut the class down because we started out with about 35 people in the class. Well, within 2 weeks, the class had gone to 68 people. And then
a familiar story. Yes,
yeah,
indeed.
And then they said, well, we don't think anybody is interested. I mean, literally. He said, so we're going to shut this class down. That's exactly what they said. And it wasn't everybody, but it was one. He said, we don't think anybody's interested in this information, so this is just going to stop. And shut the class down. And I mean, I've been in church, 6 months. My ego was shot. I mean, I'm saying, wow, this is horrible. I was embarrassed. I was standing in front of the class when he said it. And I thought, this is just horrible. I mean, if I had been anybody else that didn't have any grounding, if I hadn't had any faith, and that was one thing the book of Revelation had done for me, was really strengthen my faith, I probably would have left the church that night and never come back. But because I had such a strong conviction in what I knew I was on to something. And when he said that, the same sister jumped up in the back. She was sitting about 7 or 8 rows back. She just jumped up, and she's kind of tall anyway. And she said, I do think it makes a difference what date you assign to the book. I want to study it. And that's what I think that saved me as a Christian that night because, Like I said, she gave me so much encouragement just by what she said that I had to go underground and continue studying at that point. But that's what happened with my discovery of Luke 21, and so it's been a favorite text of mine for a long time.
Well, it's such a powerful text, and I will remember to this day that it seems like in our journeys there are certain epiphany moments and certain epiphany texts that just seemingly jump off the page and force us to reevaluate. And I was sitting in my office in Shawnee, Oklahoma. Like you, I had been studying the Olivet Discourse. I had begun, pardon me, I had begun to see the unity of the Olivet Discourse. And what I did, I took some old Bibles. I literally cut out the pages of the parallel passages from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and had the secretary blow them up as large as we could get them, put them on poster board, and I had them posted on the wall around my office. My secretary didn't like it a bit because she was a neat freak, and she just thought that looked absolutely horrible. But I told her, don't worry about it. This is my office. This is what I'm doing. That didn't please her at all. So I would look at, all I had to do was just look up at these blown up images, and I could read them in really, really large print, and I could see the obvious parallels and what have you. And I remember sitting there one day, looking at Luke 21, 22, proverbial wall fell on me, or the train ran over me, however you would like to express it. And I sit there and looked at it and looked at it and looked at it. I did my dead level best to rationalize some way out of that. Now, I tried to take the approach that David Brown in his lecture argued. Now, down through the years, I've come to realize how facile and really, honestly, naive and biblically illiterate the argument is. But David Brown made the argument. When you see all of these passages that talk about all things being fulfilled, and he went to Luke chapter 18, 30 to 32, and where it talks about all things were written concerning him, and it's talking about Jesus' suffering. And he says, see, verse 31, the all things written is limited by the verse 32. Mm-hmm. Well, that's obviously true in that text. And I don't know of anybody that argues with that. He appealed to Acts chapter 13, 28, when they had fulfilled all things concerning him. Well, David Brown once again argued, you see, the context limits the all things. It's referring to Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. So what I did on Luke 21, 22, at the very first, was to argue, well, okay, all things written just simply refers to all things written about the fall of Jerusalem. But then, of course, I began to see, with more study, with more understanding, I began to do exactly what you did. I began to see the Old Testament prophecies of the destruction of Jerusalem and how they were tied in with the end of the age, the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection. Once I saw, like you did, William, once I saw that the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection are always in the Old Testament inextricably bound up with the judgment on Jerusalem, I absolutely could not fight Luke 21, 22 anymore. And so now, when I am in conversations with people, and Luke 21, 22 comes up, and they think they have the definitive response to that, say, oh, look, you guys, you preterists are just simply all wrong on that. All the world Jesus was saying is that all things written concerning the fall of Jerusalem would be fulfilled at that time. And I respond, you are exactly right. Let's examine what the Old Testament says about the fall of Jerusalem and the events that are tied to it. And I don't have to tell you, William, when that happens, when you demonstrate that, for instance, the destruction of heaven and earth is tied to the fall of Jerusalem, Isaiah chapter 24. When you demonstrate that the resurrection and the Messianic banquet is tied to the destruction of Jerusalem, Isaiah 25, 1 through 8, and Isaiah, 26 through 27. When you demonstrate that the new heaven and the new earth is tied directly and inseparably to the destruction of Old Covenant Israel and Jerusalem in Isaiah 65, Isaiah chapter 66. As a matter of fact, there is not one single constituent eschatological element that is not linked with the fall of Jerusalem, the judgment of Old Covenant Israel in the Old Covenant. When we realize that the New Testament writers tell us that their eschatology is the anticipation of the fulfillment of the Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, then Luke 21:22 takes on added force. And it is absolutely inescapable. So when David Brown stood up there behind that pulpit at the Bellview Church Christ Lectures and just vociferously, it was more than obvious, he thought he had the definitive answer against covenant eschatology. All Luke 21:22 is talking about is the predictions and the prophecies, all things written concerning the judgment of Jerusalem. And I sat and I thought to myself, amen, hallelujah, preach it, brother, but you don't have a clue what you're admitting. Mm-hmm. You just don't have a clue. And then, William, I don't know if you got a chance to finally listen to the tape or not. Did you?
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, the reason I ask is because he asked one of those questions, and, during his presentation, William, he said, listen, ask these guys, he used that term again over and over, ask these guys, preterists, questions. They don't like questions. I'm going, yeah, right. Yeah. And, oh, by the way, David Brown made the comment, listen, brethren, when you ask people questions, when you're in controversy and you ask men questions and you pose repeated questions to them and they refuse to answer those questions over and over, you know they are false teachers. I couldn't help but reflect, William, when you and I were discussing, corresponding with Howard Denham on the As It Is Written Facebook page. And he would just fire one question after another to us and absolutely demand that we answer those questions. But then if we asked questions, which we did, he adamantly refused to answer even one, would not discuss our questions. Then lately, over the last several months, a guy named Scott Russell has been on the same page. And Scott will come on there, ask questions, but when others respond to him and ask him questions, he refuses to answer. Well, just last week, as Scott Russell had posed some questions, and I posed a series of questions in response. I answered his questions, by the way, and then I posed a series of questions to him, and he adamantly refused. And by the way, he just consistently refuses to answer any of my questions. And others on the page have taken note of it. So I cited David Brown. And I said, I would like to call your attention to the fact, Scott Russell, that David Brown says when you're in controversy And when your opponent absolutely, adamantly refuses to answer questions, you know they are teaching false doctrine. So tell us, Scott Russell, why it is you will not answer my questions. So I reposed the questions. Well, he came back and he said, well, in response to Daniel 12, there are a couple of questions to be answered. He did not answer a single one of my questions. He simply posed another couple. So I responded to his questions, reposed my questions, challenged him to answer them, and that's been almost 2 weeks, and he still hasn't answered. So it's so fascinating that here's David Brown standing on the platform at the Bellview Church of Christ, and Howard Denham was there. Now, I don't know if Scott Russell was there or not. I don't have any way of knowing. But Howard Denham was there. He was one of the speakers. And David Brown stands up and says, ask questions. When your opponents refuse to answer questions, you know they are teaching false doctrine. And Howard Denham absolutely refused to answer William Bell's questions or my questions on the Facebook page as it is written, and still refuses to answer questions from those of us who are engaged in controversy. Still refuses. He thinks he has the right, some kind of magical authority, pontifical authority, I would express it like that, to ask us any question that he wants, and we are bound, duty-bound, to answer his questions, but he has no obligation whatsoever to answer our questions. That shows the hypocrisy of the men on the dais at the Bellevue Church of Christ lectures. So the point that David Brown made, and he said, and William, I want you to respond to this. He said, if other texts limit the word all, then every text on that is limited. So he then says the destruction of Jerusalem does not refer to all Old Testament prophecy, but only the destruction of Jerusalem prophecies. Go over that one more time for us, William, to clarify that for those who are listening, because it is so critically important.
Well, of course, the text tells you these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. And, when I discuss that with people, they want to go back sometimes, and I know we're just about out of time, but they would want to go back and say, well, what about a prophecy that, let's say we talk about Noah's flood or something like that. The point is, that's not a prophecy. That's a fact once it's been fulfilled. You have to take those prophecies that were yet unfulfilled at the time that Jesus made the statement. And that is what we refer to. And when he says all, he's referring to all the prophecies that were yet unfulfilled. And if you can only limit a term by the context. And as you were mentioning that text before, when you were talking about the things that were suffered, and the passage that I like to bring up in connection with that is Luke 24, because in that text, 46 through 47, in that text he will say, these are the things that I spoke to you when I was yet with you, that all things that were written in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled concerning me. And then it says he opened their understanding that they might understand the Scriptures. Then he points out that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer. But he doesn't stop there. He says, and to rise from the dead, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name among all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. And that third and goes all the way back to Isaiah chapter 2, and doesn't end at verse 2, which a lot of them think it does. But it actually continues on, particularly through verses 3 and 4, but even beyond that to several chapters in talking about the judgment that was involved. And so if they're going to use that, they cannot use it to just simply mean the things that pertain to the Jerusalem. But here's the point. If they do, the text still says these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. It didn't just say the things that were written concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, but what that tells you, in another sense, is that all the things that were yet to be fulfilled were concerning the destruction of Jerusalem.
Amen. Okay, William, I think we've covered enough of David Brown. We'll pick up on one of the other speeches on next week. In the meantime, folks, thank you so very much for joining us right here on Fulfilled Radio, Two Guys in a Bible, a voice you can trust. Thank you for those of you who continue to sign up to be subscribers to this program. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors. We'll see you again next week here on Two Guys in a Bible. In the meantime, good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.